Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullah.
Ahlan wa sahlan ya Syekh Ahmad.
Hayyakumullah.
Welcome to our studio.
Thank you.
First, allow us to ask you some questions.
Sure.
In your profile, it is mentioned that you are a fellow of Taba Foundations.
Right.
Perhaps if you would please introduce us to Taba Foundation and its work.
Sure. My name is Ahmad Hussein Al-Azhari, and I'm a visiting fellow at Taba Foundation. Taba Foundation was established around 20 years ago by Habib Ali Al-Jifri. And to put it simply, Taba Foundation is a foundation that was established to bridge the gap between scholars and the people. Also the gap between different sorts of organizations and institutions that work in da'wah, the gap between themselves, and also the gap between them and the people as well. In some respects, it's a bridge between academia and a public discourse as well. Sometimes in academia, we can start talking to ourselves as academics or as researchers, or in a religious context as shuyukh, and forget to disseminate this knowledge or to communicate this knowledge to the general public. Taba Foundation has a number of departments. One of them is Taba Initiatives, and the other is Taba Research, amongst other departments, but I'll focus on these two. One of the projects that Taba Research has been working on is a project on the idea of the foundations of sciences, the foundations of knowledge. It is known in Arabic as Tartib al-Ulum. And this project has been supervised by Dr. Karim al-Laham, and it included a number of contributions from Dr. Karim al-Laham himself and other colleagues and ex-colleagues at Taba, like Sheikh Hassan Spiker, Sheikh Mustafa Steyer, who contributed to this project. One of the important works that were produced within this project is a work by Sheikh Hassan Spiker on a concept, a philosophical concept known as, again in the tradition known as mafhum nafs al-amr, or things as they are. This is the title of his paper, and it had a wide reception both in academia, and also resonated with some of the researchers in the Middle East as well, in the realm of philosophy. This project is quite unique because it speaks about the foundations of knowledge and the foundation of sciences, that there's a hierarchy of sciences, right? And this hierarchy, metaphysics, it is at the top of this hierarchy, and from metaphysics, all different sorts of the branches and different sorts of disciplines and sciences, they all branch from this, from the mother, from metaphysics. The first step of this project was to talk about the basic epistemological foundations for this hierarchy, right? That things exist as they are, that there are truths and realities. They are not relative, but they're rather, they exist in and of themselves. They have an existence in and of themselves. It is considered, you could say, one of the basic, and not basic not in the sense of simple, but basic in the sense of primary, one of the foundational ideas that are studied in Islamic theology and Islamic philosophy. Those who study, for example, theology at Al-Azhar al-Sharif back decades ago, they used to spend a whole semester or almost a whole year just focusing on the first statement of Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya, or of al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya itself, which says حقائق الأشياء ثابتة, the realities or the truths of things are established. وَالْعِلْمُ بِهَا مُتَحَقِّقٌ, meaning the knowing these truths, knowing these realities is possible. And scholars back in the day, they used to spend months just explaining this basic foundational epistemological position for the students, because it's the foundation of our theology and our philosophy. So this is Taba research, right? Now, Taba initiatives is more on the providing a discourse for the general public that addresses three different perspectives. We have an initiative called Su'al Initiative, the other initiative called Sanad Network, and the third initiative is called Tazkiyah wa Imara, Tazkiyah and Imara. Su'al Initiative, I had the honor and the blessing of being, I was the supervisor of this initiative for almost 2 years, especially from the very beginning of the Su'al Initiative. Su'al Initiative started as originally started as a TV program for Habib Ali Al-Jifri, known as Lahdat Sukoon, or a moment of serenity, in which Habib Ali used to have people of young age come to the studio and have a discussion with him on some of the pertinent questions, some of the imperative questions that they have in mind, usually known as al-as'ila al-kulliyya, the universal questions, or people like to call them the big questions related to the religion, related to the existence of God, related to some of the Sharia principles and Sharia laws, the laws of jurisprudence, laws of fiqh, and so on and so forth. The concept of the halal and haram in and of itself. It started as this TV program by Habib Ali Jifri called Lahdat Sukoon, a moment of serenity, and it's called moment of serenity because to think and contemplate about these questions, it requires some kind of a serenity within oneself, and you'd say a clear mind to be able to find answers for these inquiries. From there, Habib Ali tasked me to lead this initiative. One of the interesting things that after a week or so from being tasked to lead the initiative, Habib Ali conducted a meeting with me, and he asked me, so what is your first step in developing the initiative? The initiative is supposed to address the questions of the young men and women that are related to the foundations of the deen, the existence of God, predestination, why is there halal and haram, for example, things that are related to the foundations of the deen. So when he asked me what is the first step, I told him, Habib, I'll change the name of the initiative. And Habib was like, what do you mean you're going to change the name of the initiative? Your colleagues here at Taba, they have been working on the name, because it was called Lahdat Sukoon, a moment of serenity. I told him, yeah, Habib, but if I go and speak with young, especially in Taba at that point was also the headquarters was moving from Abu Dhabi to Cairo, and the initiative was going to be kick-started in Cairo. So I told him, Habib, if I speak to young folks in the street and I tell them my name is Ahmad and I come from Moment of Serenity, they're gonna laugh at me. So he smiled and he said, okay, so what do you propose? I told him I propose that we do workshops with the young folks, and we ask them if we're having this initiative, what would we call it? Do like some kind of a focus group, right? And we also sought assistance from a public communication expert, and we did these workshops with young men and women from Cairo, from different backgrounds, university students, corporate workers, different backgrounds, right? And then eventually, Lahdat Sukoon evolved to become the Su'al Initiative. Su'al means question, right? And the slogan of it, Min haqqi as'al, it's my right to ask. And also for those of you, who know Arabic, Min haqqi as'al, you can also read it colloquially. So you can say Min haqqi as'al, Min haqqi as'al, Min haqqi as'al. So it can suit all the different dialects of Arabic in the Arab world. So Su'al Initiative basically evolved from there, addressing the big questions related to Islam, and it's available online. You can go to sual.org, suaal.org. The very first research that was published by Su'al Initiative is a research I worked on titled Hal is-su'al mamnu'? Are questions prohibited? Meaning questions about God, questions about al-qadar, questions about metaphysical questions. Are they haram? Is it haram to ask a question about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or His attributes? And it was about basically responding to some of the misinterpretations of some of the ayat and hadith, some of the verses and the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ that some preachers use to convey that it is haram to ask questions. You know, unfortunately, we have been suffering from this discourse where preachers who are not well equipped in theology, they don't know how to answer the questions of the youth. So when they have a young man coming at the masjid, for example, asking a question, they say, "Oh, are you an atheist? You know, this is the path to atheism because you're asking these questions. لا تسألوا عن أشياء إن تبد لكم تسؤكم." You know, don't ask about things if they are revealed to you, they would harm you. So these misquoted verses of the Quran, misinterpreted verses of the Quran, the research basically that I wrote was talking about the correct understanding of these verses and these ahadith and so on and so forth. And as much as they're being used by preachers who are not well equipped in theology, also used by some people who have a hostile position towards Islam or towards the the Islamic tradition. They say, "Oh, Islam prohibits questioning. Islam is not for, does not call for questioning or inquiry or some sort of a contemplative investigation. Islam is about dogma, indoctrinating people, not allowing them to ask questions, and so on and so forth." So it was really important in that regard. So this is Su'al initiative. Another initiative is called Sanad Network, and Sanad Network is focused on the other sort of misinterpretations, which is basically the misinterpretations, or you could say the hijacking of the verses of the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to be used to justify terrorist attacks. So it dissects the foundations, or you could say the principles that are used by groups like ISIS and so on and so forth. It digs deep into these, the foundations of this type of thinking and this type of interpretation, and it provides responses. So it's basically an initiative that is targeted towards, counter-terrorism from the perspective of thought, of ideas, of concepts. That are being used by terrorist groups and so on and so forth, using Islam for political or to political gain, or to justify some kind of a terrorist act. So this is the Sanad Network. This is what it's focused on: the hijacking of Islam for political gains, or hijacking the hadith for to justify violent attacks. The third initiative is called Tazkiyah wa Imara. Just by the way, before I elaborate on Tazkiyah wa Imara, Tazkiyah wa Imara also incorporates, since we're conducting this in English, so Tazkiyah wa Imara involves also Sheikh Yahya Rodis. He contributes to Tazkiyah wa Imara through a commentary on Al-Hikam Al-Ata'iyya, the aphorisms of Sidi ibn Ata'illah Secondary, on the initiative Tazkiyah wa Imara. So Tazkiyah wa Imara is actually towards spirituality, towards the meanings that are related to the development of the inner existence of the person. It's also related to other activities. Involves Rawdat al-Na'im, for example, which is a learning center that is established near the Jami', near the mosque of Sayyidina al-Hussein alayhi salam in Cairo. So that's the focus of Tazkiyah wa Imara in a nutshell. I know I'm already taking too much of your time to answer this the question on Taba. So I hope this can give you like basically some of the background of the work that is done with Taba. I forgot to mention with Sanad Network is that they're also working now on a database for the different sort of Islamist groups based on their original sources, meaning the books, the pamphlets, the treatises that they produced And it's basically like an encyclopedia of all the key figures in terms of the Islamist groups, their ideas, their connection between one another, with references. And this is done for academics, those who want to do research into, you could say, academic research into counterterrorism, and knowing the different ideas and tracing the different ideas, their origin, how they evolved, and so on and so forth. This is something that is undergoing also in Sanad Network that I forgot to mention.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Such amazing words.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
You mentioned that you have worked alongside Habib Ali Al-Jufri, Sheikh Yahya Rhodes, and perhaps you also have learned from other scholars. Some have mentioned, it is also mentioned in your profile with the Sheikh Usama Al-Azhari. So perhaps you can give us a bit stories about them and how is your relationship with them.
Right. Well, this is a difficult question to answer given the time that we have, right? So I would have to do selection in a very concise way. So I'll do my best, inshallah. So now, Maulana Sheikh Usama is a board member of Taba Foundation. So these the projects that I just explained, whether the three initiatives that I mentioned, Sheikh Usama is involved in it in terms of guidance, supervision, mentorship at a strategic level. So alhamdulillah, I think I benefited greatly from Sheikh Usama in terms of mentorship. In two regards: mentorship in terms of study, in terms of personal studying, personal seeking of knowledge, right? And also I benefited from him greatly when it comes to having a basira, or having a hikmah, a wisdom, insight in terms of the public discourse, right? How to address different topics that are complicated, topics that are people have different perspectives about. I benefited greatly from Sheikh Usama in terms of mentorship in this regard, right? How to address complex issues in a public realm, in a public discourse. And also how to deal with different situations, because in da'wah and religious discourse, you get sometimes in situation where you have to deal with, for example, with conflicting parties, right? You give a speech or a talk, let's say, in a country like Indonesia, or a country like any other country in Southeast Asia, right? And you as a visitor, for example, not necessarily fully aware of all the different sensitivities that people might have, for example, right? So I learned from Sheikh Usama is to be keen to learn about other people's cultures, other people's sensitivities, other people's interests, to learn, spend time learning about these contexts before speaking, before being keen to do a talk or an event or participate in some kind of a conference or something of that sort, to spend time understanding the reality, basically the context, the environment, the society, the culture. And this is something, subhanallah, Sheikh Usama, when you speak to him, about, I would tell him, I'm going to Malaysia to do this, I'm going to Indonesia to do this, I'm going to Australia. I find him very aware of what's going on in each country, the different sort of organizations that operate in these countries, what they do, how to collaborate with them, their achievements, what the efforts that they have been doing, how to bring benefit, how to be an addition to the places that you visit, to the organizations that you collaborate with. So I learned from Sheikh Usama, to summarize, I learned from Sheikh Usama, number one, I would say seriousness, right? When I said that I benefited from his mentorship when it comes to knowledge, I remember at one time I visited Sheikh Osama at his office, and I was taking his advice regarding a book that I was working on. I spent like an hour and a half, 2 hours, detailing all the different references that I need to read, and he would explain to me, this reference you get so and so from, this reference you get so and so from. So it's basically the whole hour and a half. It wasn't like a class, right? It was just like it was almost like not an interview, but it was like just a mentorship meeting, an appointment, right? And I found myself like coming out with like 5 pages of notes, names of books and authors, and by the way, like when I went to visit Sheikh Osama, like I didn't tell him like what is the subject of the appointment, right? But so basically, it's not like something that he prepared for me. That was like on top of his head, right? Giving me all the names and the references of the books and the authors that I need to review. So I learned from him when it comes to the study, seriousness. When it comes to da'wah or religious discourse, again, seriousness in the sense of being comprehensive. So this would be the second thing I learned from him: being comprehensive, going into all the small details, all the little details that people, wouldn't notice, wouldn't pay attention to. And being keen to learn about the people that you're going to speak to about Islam, right? People usually invest time in da'wah and, okay, what am I supposed to say? But they forget to focus on the question of, okay, this thing that I'm supposed to say, who am I going to say it to, right? So learning about the other, in a sense. Sheikh Osama, I learned from him this profound capacity to basically learn about people, right? And learning about them in a keen way. So you would find Sheikh Osama also speaking to people, let's say like maybe Indonesians or Malaysians, or and you would be surprised, like he would know things about the history of Indonesia that maybe some of the Indonesian folks not necessarily know of, right? You see, like you're smiling because that's the reality. Like you find Sheikh Osama, mashallah, okay, so he's Egyptian, but you find him like learning in a very keen interest about other people's cultures and societies and so on and so forth, what they like, what they don't like, their habits, their preferences, their sensitivities, and he's very aware of these things in a very meticulous way. So he doesn't approach da'wah in a haphazard fashion. Very comprehensive is in his approach. So this is what I would have to say about the mentorship of Sheikh Osama. And I would say the same thing, honestly, about Habib Ali. The same care, the same seriousness, the same attention to details, same wisdom in addressing matters that are whether that are sensitive or that people or that are complex and require a particular approach in addressing, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure if we still have time, but I mean this is what relates to Sheikh Osama per se. But there's something I would want to mention, something that I learned about and I learned from Habib Ali as well. Habib Ali, besides what I mentioned in terms of the seriousness and the attention to details and so on and so forth, but also not forgetting the human interaction while he's doing his work, right? So I learned. This is not something that I know directly, but I learned, like Habib Ali, for example, in one of his travels to the UK, and he had a certain schedule of events and so on and so forth. And there was a brother in the UK who used to serve the visiting scholars and the shuyukh, to drive them around from one program to another, from their place of residence to the program and this and that. And Habib Ali learned that this brother was a little bit, you could say, sad or disappointed that some of the shuyukh, when they kind of you can say grow popular, they kind of forgot about him. So Habib Ali, when he was visiting and people showed him the schedule, he said, cancel this event, put instead of it, in the same slot, visiting this brother's house. And Habib Ali canceled the whole public event to visit that brother at his house, gave him a visit and his family on his own, like no other visitors from outside, something for that brother, right? So this is something that I learned from Habib Ali, that while he's doing his da'wah work, all the responsibilities about, teaching, educating, guiding, addressing hot topics, addressing important questions, addressing sensitive issues, and so on and so forth, he doesn't lose focus when it comes to, people who are around him, the human touch, basically, right? The interactions at the human level, not the da'wah level, speeches and talks and events, but he's also aware of these subtle interactions with human beings that are around him. So this is something that I wanted to squeeze in there, despite the going overboard with the time. Go ahead.
That's amazing.
Alhamdulillah.
My third question, I want to talk about Islamic philosophy, as this is a topic that you focused on also. I want to know about Islamic philosophy. How is your view about it, and its role in da'wah, and how can we use it in da'wah nowadays?
Okay, this is a very, very important question, especially that philosophy in the Muslim world, unfortunately, has a negative impression. People look at philosophy, unfortunately, in the Muslim world as if it's something that is associated with not necessarily atheism, but with false beliefs of one way, shape, or form. And believe it or not, one of the reasons, I'm not saying the reason, but one of the reasons why this false impression is there is some of the Orientalists who did studies on Islamic philosophy portrayed the key figures in our tradition as individuals or as scholars who have a hostile position towards philosophy. So for many years, people look at, especially even in academia in the Muslim world, people, or rather I should say professors, college students, college academics, post-grad students, they followed, without consideration, they followed the position of some of the early Orientalists who portrayed, let me give you an example, who portrayed Imam al-Ghazali, for example, as the one who killed philosophy, who ended philosophical discourse, and that Ibn Rushd or Averroes was the one who tried to revive philosophy. But philosophy was basically killed by the hands of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Now this idea, this perception that Imam al-Ghazali, slayed philosophy, and philosophy was no longer evolving and studied in the Muslim world, this idea that was championed by some of the Orientalists in early last century is now laughable in Western academia. So Western academics now, they say, we don't know how those people, from the West, those Orientalists from the West made such, false claims, outrageous claims. And you find most of the academics, I'm not talking about Muslim academics per se, I'm just saying Western academics, right now they say, Imam al-Ghazali actually contributed greatly to philosophy and the dissemination of philosophy and the growing of the philosophical studies. But the problem is that you find until this present day, in universities in the Muslim world, and specifically in the Arab world, you would find that the history books about the history of philosophy in the Islamic tradition ends at Ibn Rushd, as if after Ibn Rushd there wasn't a philosophical discourse. Imam al-Ghazali gave that strong punch, knocking philosophy out. Ibn Rushd tried to bring it back up again, but it didn't really survive beyond. And they miss out on the great contributions of scholars like Fakhruddin al-Razi, Athir al-Din al-Abhari, Najm al-Din al-Katibi, and then scholars who developed philosophical theology like al-Baydawi, like al-Iji, like Sa'd al-Din al-Taftazani, like Sayyid Sharif Jurjani. Those scholars, they were philosophers as much as they were theologians. And they addressed very intricate subjects when it comes to philosophy. The scholars that I mentioned and other scholars of their like as well. And the questions, the philosophical questions and the philosophical inquiry and study remained in the Ummah for centuries after Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali did not, by the way, people look at Imam al-Ghazali that he killed philosophy, but actually Imam al-Ghazali was one of the reasons why philosophical studies emerged, right? Because he didn't merely critique the philosophers. He wrote Maqasid al-Falasifa, which is a work on the philosophical ideas, right, of the philosophy, especially of Ibn Sina. And then he wrote a number of works on logic, which is the instrument, the instrument of philosophical discourse and philosophical study, logic, al-mantiq. He wrote Ma'yar al-Ilm. He wrote Al-Qistas al-Mustaqim, which basically a work on logic that is in a language that is suitable for the young, for the students of Islamic studies and the young folks and so on and so forth, right? He wrote a number of work. Also his work Al-Mustasfa, which is a work on Usul al-Fiqh, an introduction of it is on the art of logic. So Imam al-Ghazali helped the dissemination of logic and the use of logic in the various Islamic disciplines, right? Whether Usul al-Fiqh, whether fiqh, whether theology. He has, you could say, a concise application of logic in the introduction of his work in theology, Al-Iqtisad, fi al-I'tiqad. And he influenced other scholars as well, even some of the Hanbali scholars like Ibn Qudama. His first iteration, the first version of his first edition of his work, Rawdat al-Nadhir wa Junnat al-Munadhir in Usul al-Fiqh, had an introduction in logic. So Imam al-Ghazali helped the dissemination of logic, and then this basically paved the way for Imam Fakhr al-Din al-Razi to write great works of philosophy like Al-Mabahith al-Mashriqiyya, Al-Matalib al-Aliyya fi al-Ilm al-Ilahi. Al-Mabahith al-Mashriqiyya, he wrote it early on in his life, and then Al-Matalib al-Aliyya fi al-Ilm al-Ilahi, he wrote it at the very end of his career and his life, rahimahullah wa radiya anhu. So there were great contributions. In India, there were scholars until recent centuries. Philosophy was studied in a very meticulous way, and they used to study Hidayat al-Hikmah by Athir al-Din al-Abhari, which is basically a philosophy textbook that was taught in India and was taught in the Ottoman Empire as well. Some of the shuyukh at al-Azhar early last century, like Sheikh Muhammad Bakhit al-Muti'i, he used to teach Shifa by Ibn Sina, which is the encyclopedia of Ibn Sina in philosophy. And Sheikh Makhlouf, who used to attend his class, he said, we used to understand Sheikh Muti'i, but then he reaches a point in his explanation that we don't understand a word of what he said. It's as if he's talking in English, right? And he said that كأنه يتكلم بالإنجليزية, as if he's talking English, so we don't know like what he's saying. But the point is that what Sheikh Makhlouf was trying to say is that Sheikh Bakhit al-Muti'i, Sheikh Bakhit rahimahullah, and he was the Mufti of Egypt. No, he was the Mufti of Egypt. He used to go so deep in the works of Ibn Sina to the point that even the advanced students like Sheikh Makhlouf would not understand what he was saying there. So philosophy was present in the Islamic tradition, and you find that all of the shuyukh of al-Azhar were students of philosophy. Even the current Imam, Mawlana al-Imam al-Akbar, Syekh Ahmad Tayyib, Dr. Ahmad Tayyib, his PhD and his masters are in philosophy. His master's degree is on Abu al-Barakat ibn Malka, a famous philosopher at his time who wrote Al-Mu'tabar fi al-Hikmah. And then his work, PhD, which is done in the Sorbonne in France, is on Sayyidi Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi radiyallahu anhu. So I mean, he gets into, the Shuyukh of al-Azhar, they used to get into these deep philosophical studies and it wasn't seen as something that would make the person an apostate or a disbeliever or something of that sort. But again, as I told you, one of the key factors why people have this negative impression towards philosophy, an aspect of it was caused by Orientalism. Those who came from the West, who studied the Orient, who studied the East, and they had certain biases, you could say. And because of these biases, they assumed, they thought that the Muslim world doesn't really appreciate philosophy. And then they had these wrong conclusions or false conclusions about key figures in Islam, like Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. All right? So this is one reason. The other reason is that there was also a religious discourse that benefited from this, right? And this religious discourse is hostile towards philosophy. Philosophy, for this discourse, is associated again with false beliefs. And therefore, it used these, you could say, terminologies or words to classify scholars who address philosophical concepts as if they don't belong to the tradition. Let me give you a clear example. I said earlier the first statement of Al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya, which is حقائق الأشياء ثابتة. The realities of things are established. وَالْعِلْمُ بِهَا مُتَحَقِّقٌ. And knowing them is possible. Now, this statement is a statement that is said in the beginning of a creed, Al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya, by Imam al-Nasafi, Najmuddin al-Nasafi. And then explained by Imam Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani in Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya. Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya was one of the most studied textbooks of theology in Islamic history throughout the centuries. One of the most widely studied works. And the first statement of it, or the first segment of the commentary, is addressing this statement: حقائق الأشياء ثابتة. The realities of things are established. Imam al-Taftazani, in his commentary, he engages with a critique of the philosophy of relativism, right? Relativism, which has a number of, you could say, of classifications and sub-branches, but basically, simply speaking, relativism is about that ideas, or not ideas, rather concepts, don't have established realities, right? And this could have implications in morals as well. So one could say lying is bad, the other person say no, lying is good, right? You can deem lying as good, I can deem lying as bad, or vice versa. You don't have the right to say if I'm right or wrong. I don't have the right to say if you are right or wrong. Each one of us could see differently, and we don't have to argue about this. Each one of us has their own beliefs, and they can project their own beliefs on these ideas and concepts, and there is no way for us to find out which is the true belief, okay? Either that there's no true belief at all, or there's no way to find out whether it's true or not, okay? This idea of relativism is alive today, right? Is alive today. Many of what we see on social media is based on that. It's based on relativism. When you find, for example, someone who's popular, soccer player, artist, whatever it may be, right? Something happens in their private life. That is wrong, or that is, let's say, not a wrong, but some kind of a problem that occurs. Maybe a soccer player divorced his wife, right? What do you find? What happens in social media? Everybody's talking about it, right? And then when you speak even to some Muslims, right? You're not supposed to indulge into the private lives of individuals. What do they say? Yeah, but he's popular. Yeah, what does that mean? I mean, in our deen, this qualifier that the person is popular, that would never justify that you indulge in their private lives, right? But they're popular. So, and even worse, you find people on social media, they critique, let's say someone makes a post that they became an atheist or something, right? you find some people go on there to comment, or maybe a sister took off her hijab or something of that sort. You find people cursing them out in the comments, right? And cursing them out, meaning using swear words against them, right? Being violent verbally against them, while also trying to defend Islam. So they're trying to defend the deen by cursing people's fathers and mothers. You get the crazy reality that we're in. It's as if they see that da'wah is done through shatm, through cursing out. So there is we think that relativism, for example, wouldn't really affect Muslims, but it is affecting Muslims, right? If you tell him this is haram, they wouldn't say, oh wait, let me consider if my action is haram. No, they would say, yeah, but don't you see what that other person is doing? If they can do this, I can do this. See? There's an embedded sense of relativism in there, some way, shape, or form, right? And then, I mean, it has other implications in our realities and that we experience nowadays. So Sheikh Taftazani, Imam Taftazani, was addressing this issue. Some of the religious preachers who have this hostile position towards philosophy says, why do you guys study aqaid nasafiyya? Why do you need to tell Muslims that haqa'iq al-ashya' thabita, that realities of things that are established? We are not the Greeks. You guys are following the Greeks. We write aqaid, we write works of creed for Muslims, not for the Yunan, not for the Greeks. And they speak about these discussions as if they are irrelevant, not important, cannot be beneficial, right? But then the reality is that these ideas, these concepts that are mentioned in the works of theology and philosophy that our scholars used to study and teach, they are very relevant to today's challenges, philosophical challenges. So this is the aspect regarding philosophy. Now, you said, how could philosophy be used in da'wah? Philosophy would not be used in da'wah in the same format that it is studied in academics, in academia, or in the circles of knowledge and so on and so forth. Philosophy in da'wah is more for the da'i, for the person who's conducting the da'wah, to understand the philosophies of the time and how they affect people's behaviors and people's choices, people's inclinations and people's biases, right? So the more you would study the biases of today's world, you would the more you study the philosophies of today's world, the more you can cater your da'wah to address the specific questions that people are looking for answers for, right? So for example, postmodernism is a philosophy that is now decaying, but it was very present for the past decades. Right? Postmodernism is not about, for example, we were just talking about finding the truth, determining what is truthful from what is false. Postmodernism is about, no, it's not that it's not the idea of truth and false, or whether there's a way to find truth or false. Postmodernism is about whether you're interesting or not. So when you look at an idea, you don't evaluate the idea or the concept, the proposition, the statement that is said, the opinion. Is it truthful? Is it false? Is it right? Is it wrong? No. This is put aside. Is it interesting? Like, should we care or should we not? So now the questions that some youth have, it's not about whether the religion is truthful or not, whether the deen is right or wrong. The question becomes, why should I care? This is the question that you find some of the youth are asking. Why even care about, why bother about the question? It's not about, is Islam true? They're asking, is it even interesting to think about this question? You get the point? So this comes from postmodernism. Another issue that comes from postmodernism is basically what we call a defragmented reality, where goodness, beauty, and truthfulness are not related anymore to each other. What do we mean by that? In our tradition, truth, يعني الحق, truth, and al-khair, goodness, and al-jamal, beauty, they are all connected. It's like a triangle. So when you go to Jami' al-Azhar and you study what is truth and what is truthful, you would then go to Jami' al-Sultan Hassan, and which is a remarkable, building in terms of architecture. When you enter Jami' al-Sultan Hassan, it has a very narrow path. Okay? If you go there during Salat al-Dhuhr, and Egypt is a very sunny country for most of the year, when you enter the pathway, the entrance of Jami' al-Sultan Hassan, it's very dim, even if it's Salat al-Dhuhr. But once you enter Sahn al-Masjid, meaning the main, you could say the main part of the Jami', you immediately find the light of the sun. So this architecture of this Muslim engineer who architected Jami' al-Sultan Hassan, what was in their mind? They wanted to reflect the truthful reality that ad-dunya is narrow in comparison to the akhirah, right? So we come and dunya is darkness and the akhirah is light. So they want the Muslim, as they are entering Jami' al-Sultan Hassan, that the architecture would reflect the truth. So the beauty reflects the truth. And this was present in all the calligraphy, the crafts, and so on and so forth. Now when you look at postmodern art, you find a canvas and some scribble on it, right? And then you find people in museums looking at the canvas like this. What does it say, right? And if you ask what was the intention of the artist, they say the artist doesn't have an intention. So you tell them, okay, so what is the intended meaning? There is no intended meaning. You are the one who's supposed to project the meaning upon the painting. But the artist had no meaning. Okay, what is the relation between this philosophy and da'wah? The way people look at postmodern art is the same way they look at the universe. What does that mean? There is no artist. There is no God. There is no intended meaning behind the creation of this universe. It has no meaning. You project your meaning. So this is why you find many questions now from youth. What is the meaning of life? One of the reasons of asking this question, because of this philosophy that got injected into people's minds, that the world has no meaning. There was no ultimate goal, no ultimate objective behind the creation of the world, just like postmodern art has no objective, no meaning. But you, as a person who visits a museum or the art gallery, you are the one who's supposed to create the meaning. So now human beings, instead of trying to look in the universe, قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانْظُرُوا كَيْفَ بَدَأَ الْخَلْقِ, walk on earth and contemplate about how the world began. Instead of doing that and asking questions, metaphysical questions, people now say, okay, what would that meaning be? Let me create one for myself. Because there is no meaning to uncover. It's no longer a journey where we try to unearth and uncover, find this, unravel the meaning behind the universe that Allah created. No. Because the artist, see, this is something also related to postmodernism. The postmodern philosophers declared God is dead. And they also did that in terms of writers. Roland Barthes authored this treatise called The Death of the Author. So when you read a book, you don't look for the intended meaning of the writer. You make the meaning, not search for the meaning that the author wanted to say. This, by the way, will be applied by postmodernists to the Quran. They're not going to look for the meanings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for the verses. They say, we create our own meanings. You understand the verse this way, I would understanding something else. And this is not the spiritual understanding, like, the tafsir of the Sufi saints. No, this is a postmodern read of the Quran. And they do a postmodern read to the works of fiqh as well, and so on and so forth. So you can see how postmodernism, I just gave you an example of, postmodern art, and how it relates to people's attitude towards the world, their existence, and God. So the person who does da'wah needs to be aware of these things, right? Needs to be aware of these things. It's no longer about proving what is truthful or proving what is right versus what is wrong, or what is truthful versus what is false. It's about, is there a meaning to begin with? Finding meaning in our existence, finding meaning in the world that we live in, right? So I hope that could convey a little bit how can philosophy relate to da'wah. The da'i needs to understand the philosophical underpinnings of people's realities, so that when they structure, when they style their da'wah, it has to be structured in a way, molded in a way that addresses these questions.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Another sensitive topic maybe about Sufism.
Okay.
How is the perspective of science and philosophy regarding Sufism?
Okay, let me address philosophy per se, maybe more than science, and then I'll explain why, and I'll come to that shortly, inshallah. Philosophy and Sufism, they're related, but they're different. Different in the sense, philosophy is a rational investigation, a rational inquiry into the origin of all origins, into the cause of all causes, into the metaphysical beginning or the metaphysical cause for the physical existence. And the aim of philosophy is similar to the aim of tasawwuf, in the sense that philosophy is about knowing things as they are to reach the most perfect human state one could ever reach, right? So in philosophy, the aim of it ultimately is perfecting the human self. Tasawwuf also has this aim, the perfection of the human self. But the approach of tasawwuf is not through rational investigation, but through practices and rituals that are based on the Quran and Sunnah, by being immersed in a spiritual experience and spiritual activity through which one would perfect their inner self. So they relate to each other in terms of the aim, the objective, but the means for that objective, they're different, from philosophy to tasawwuf, to Sufism. Science is a word that causes a lot of controversy, because science in our contemporary times is confined and limited to empirical sciences, to chemistry and medicine and biology and physics and astrophysics and so on and so forth, to things that are done in a lab. Meanwhile, science in its origin was about knowledge, not about correlations only. Modern science, empirical science, is about unraveling the correlations between supposedly causes for certain effects. Okay? Correlations. But science back in the day, this will bring us to the concept of the hierarchy of sciences, where metaphysics was there. Science was a part of coming to know oneself, coming to know the universe, and coming to know God. So even our inquiry in chemistry, biology, medicine, physics, astronomy, you can trace the findings and the conclusions back to the metaphysical origins. Any mas'ala, any issue of these sciences back in our tradition, you can ultimately trace it to its metaphysical origin. But this is not how science today is. Some people try to use science maybe to prove some spiritual realities, but I would advise to take great caution from doing this. We have witnessed in the Arab world, and I don't know, maybe also in Southeast Asia, I'm not sure, or you could say the Muslim world in general, we have witnessed, unfortunately, at some point, there were preachers who talk about the scientific miracles of the Quran. I don't know if this, okay, so you relate to it as well.
It's familiar.
So the scientific miracles of the Quran. Now the problem is that they try to interpret the verses of the Quran according to scientific theories. Now for a theory to be a theory, it has to be falsifiable, right? A scientific theory, for it to be a theory, it has to be falsifiable by data. If it's not falsifiable by experiment, then it is either a philosophical claim or it's a fact. So for a theory to be a theory, like Big Bang theory, right? Theory of evolution. For a theory to be a theory, it has to be falsifiable by experiment. So when those preachers interpreted the Quran and said, okay, this verse means the conclusion of this scientific theory. The problem is that when these theories were falsified, many of the Muslim youth had issues in faith, because they said, oh wait, you use these scientific theories to prove the truthfulness of the Quran. Now these theories are falsified, so are the verses also falsified? So we should be very cautious to prove spiritual realities through an empirical approach. One has to take caution regarding this. Philosophical discourse and spiritual discourse, it is very important that they both be combined. And some of the early philosophers in our ummah, like Ibn Sina, for example, in his work Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, the very end, the last part of his work is on Maqamat al-Arifin. People don't know this. Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, which is on a work of, it's a philosophy textbook, but the last part of it is on the different ranks and stations of knowing God, of getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He does that, of course, from a philosophical background. He's not a Sufi, saint. But Ibn Sina, regardless of his great interest in philosophical research and discourse, he also saw the importance of spiritual ascension, of a spiritual journey, of a spiritual path. Many of the Sufis as well, as much as they are Sufis, they also contributed to some of the philosophical studies, like Maulana, for example, Maulana Mulla Jami radiallahu anhu authored a treatise called Ad-Durra al-Fakhira, in which he does comparisons between the Sufis, the philosophers, and their theologians. And he explains how the Sufis were able to reconcile and encompass the positions of philosophers and theologians. So we have philosophers who had great interest in tasawwuf, and we had Sufis who were practicing or who were indulged in a philosophical discourse as well. All in all, they're different in their approach, but they can overlap in their objective. Yeah.
I see. Regarding tasawwuf or Sufism, I believe you are familiar with Tariqa Alawiyya or Tariqa Sada al-Ba'alawi. Perhaps you can give a bit of your view about the Tariqa.
Jazakumullah ta'ala khair. I think one of the ways to summarize the Tariqa of Sada al-Ba'alawi is through the words of Habib Tahir bin Hussein radiallahu anhu, who said that the first cornerstone of Tariqa al-Ba'alawi is إحكام عقيدة أهل السنة والجماعة, to perfect one's knowledge of the creed of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and then to practice the deen according to the Quran and Sunnah with a great emphasis on the way the Prophet ﷺ the athar of the Prophet ﷺ, the narrations of how the Prophet ﷺ practiced the deen. And when we say the athar of how the Prophet ﷺ practiced the deen, meaning not just to practice the deen, or not just to make your actions aligned with the actions of the Prophet ﷺ in terms of the outward structure or the outward form of the action, but also the inward form. So when they say ittiba' al-athar, they don't merely say, okay, following the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in how he practiced the deen outwardly, but also in how he practiced the deen inwardly, with a great emphasis on the adab of the Prophet ﷺ. So not just the halal and haram, not just the acts that are masnoon, that are recommended, but also the adab, the etiquette of doing what is an obligation, the etiquette of doing what is masnoon. And more importantly, I think, especially for Sada al-Ba'alawi, is realizing the priorities of the Prophet ﷺ. So many people try to align their actions with the actions of the Prophet ﷺ, again, in terms of form. But they rarely try to align their understanding with the understanding of the Prophet ﷺ, or to align their priorities with the priorities that the Prophet ﷺ has set for himself and for his ummah, right? So Sada al-Ba'alawi would give great attention to this concept of priorities, right? It's not just merely knowing what you're supposed to do, and it's not merely knowing how to do what you're supposed to do, right? But also realizing the priorities of what you're supposed to do, right? So this is something that I find of profound importance in Tariqah Sada al-Ba'alawi. And one of the expressions of that could be, it is ittiba' al-mansus ala wajh al-makhsus. Ittiba' al-mansus meaning it's the following and adhering to the sacred texts. Ala wajh al-makhsus meaning in a very special way, from a very special perspective that I just explained in the Sada al-Ba'alawi. Of course, the Sada al-Ba'alawi, they follow the Aqeedah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, but primarily they follow Shafi'i fiqh, though they don't mandate that every student every follower of the tariqah to be a Shafi'i per se. So you find someone like myself, I'm Hanafi, but it can also be Ba'alawi, right? But they primarily, because of the region in which the tariqah of Sada al-Ba'alawi evolved, with great attention to the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i. And there I have to say something. Even the great Naqshbandi saint, who is known as Mujaddid al-Alf al-Thani, Imam al-Sarhindi, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, was the revival of the deen in the second millennium. He wrote in al-Maktubat that the great saints, the great saint of his time, was known as the Qutb, or the pillar of saints, would follow the Shafi'i madhab, even though Imam al-Sarhindi was a Hanafi. And this can be unpacked through the words of Sayyidi Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani and others, who was a great Shafi'i a great Shafi'i jurist and Egyptian saint. See, the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i is known as madhab Ahl al-Wara'. It is the school of jurisprudence, especially when it comes to the matters of ibadat and even mu'amalat. It is the madhab that takes the position that is the farthest from any controversy. Because al-wara', basically you keep a distance between yourself and any doubtful matter, right? Anything that is doubtful, al-wara' is basically keeping a great distance between yourself and what is doubt, what can be a cause of doubt, a cause for a mistake or an error or a fault. So the madhab of Sayyidina al-Imam al-Shafi'i radiyallahu ta'ala anhu is known as madhab Ahl al-Wara'. So Sada al-Ba'alawi, perhaps this could be one of the reasons, other than the geography or the region, right? One of the reasons that also the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i is the madhab of Ahl al-Wara'. So this is a tariqah of Wara'. Lastly, to conclude, in terms of the characteristics or traits of the tariqah of Sad al-Ba'alawi is known as shuhud al-minna. Shuhud al-minna is basically to witness Allah's blessings upon you. This is another key principle alongside al-ilm wal-amal, knowledge and acting upon the knowledge, besides al-wara' and other key concepts and principles of the tariqah. Shuhud al-minna, which is to be in a continuous state of witnessing the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon you. And this results in the haya, in shyness in one's treatment and connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if you continuously witness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has great blessings that are bestowed upon you, both inwardly and outwardly, both apparent and subtle. When one is always in the state of witnessing the minnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on one hand, one would be shy that they would do acts that are prohibited by Allah. One would be shy not to be present when it is time to apply what is obligatory. But it could also lead to witnessing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one would, through witnessing the blessing of Allah, ultimately one would witness the one who provides the blessing.
Having talked about Islamic philosophy, Sufism and Tariqah al-Ba'alawi, why are the teachings of Tasawwuf and the Tariqahs are hard to be accepted by the awam, by the general Muslims, the general people? And how do we spread these teachings in modern days?
Okay, mashallah, this is an interesting question because, if you had asked this question, let's say 200 years ago, it would have sounded funny to people, because Tasawwuf was part of the daily culture for all Muslims, basically, right? Tasawwuf was basically the practicality of Islamic religiosity. It's how people practice the deen. They practice it through Tasawwuf. Tasawwuf was basically meshed with people's cultures, people's routines, people's daily and weekly activities in different formats, in different forms, between families, neighborhoods, communities, zawaya, which is like the mosques of the communities, and so on and so forth. It came in different forms. And also what was really unique about Tasawwuf is that regardless of which Sufi path that was present in any community, it never tried to alter or change or unify all Muslims under one culture, right? So it was a space for Muslims where they can find the deen of Islam meets their culture, their indigenous culture, basically, and they interact together. And many cultures that we experience today, when we visit, you could say the Muslim capitals in the world, when you visit Old Cairo, when you visit you could say the villages in Indonesia, right? When you visit mosques in Malaysia and Singapore, when you visit mosques in Africa, you find commonalities, but you also find uniqueness, right? When you listen to the inshad of our brothers in Ivory Coast or in Senegal, right, or in Nigeria, and then you listen to the inshad of our brothers and sisters in Morocco, and then you listen to the inshad of brothers and sisters in Egypt, and then in Indonesia and in Yemen, you find commonalities. They speak about same meanings. Speak about love of the Prophet ﷺ. Speak about yearning for connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Speak about Tawheed. Right? And Tawheed not just in the, in the sense of saying La ilaha illallah, but Tawheed in the sense that reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and no one else. Having husn dhann fillah, meaning to have a goodwill in your Lord, that whatever calamities, whatever adversities, whatever challenges that you're going through, there is a wisdom behind it, and there is a benefit and a good consequence that will ultimately unravel from whatever challenge or adversity or difficulty that you're facing. So connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at these levels, and also reviving the sense of love and connection with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So they speak about the same meanings, but each one in their own way and style. And even nowadays, you find communities, Sufi communities in the UK, for example, you find them doing inshad of al-burda in English. They say Mawlaya salli wa sallim da'iman abada, but then they continue the rest of the poem in English, and it's with a rhythm as well, right? So I have came to experience this, to experience a burda that is in English, and I experienced that in Australia, and I experienced a burda that is in Kurdish when Habib Ali al-Jifri and Sheikh Usama received two of the great Kurdish scholars of our time, Mullah Tayyib al-Bahraki and Mullah Tahir al-Bahraki. Mullah Tayyib, rahimahullah, he passed away recently, and Mullah Tahir is now continuing the legacy of his older brother. When they visited Egypt, within the students who followed them to Egypt, they did a chanting of al-Burda in Kurdish. We would all recite with them as they say Mawlaya salli wa sallim da'iman abada ala habibika khayri khalqi kullihim, and then they continue in their Kurdish, but subhanallah, the vibes that you would get, you don't understand the Kurdish words, right? But it's the same vibes that you would get as you're listening to al-Burda in Arabic, for example. So this is what is really profound about tasawwuf, is that people were able to relate to the spirituality of Islam while following the Kitab and Sunnah, while being meshed with meanings of love and communion and connection with one another, and also preserving their culture, right? So if you ask this question, if you had you asked this question 200 years ago, it would have sounded funny, because there wasn't any other way for people to practice, right, the deen other than that. This is what my grandparents, and their parents, this is how they practice the deen. This is what they know of Islam, basically, right? But then there was you could say there was a shift within the Muslim culture, right? There was a crack within the Muslim culture, and then an emergence of an alternative Islamic culture to the one that is infused with tasawwuf, to another one that is infused with a literal understanding of Islam. And sometimes there are verses, by the way, that ought to be understood literally. There are texts that are supposed to be understood literally and taken face value. But what I mean by literal here, literal in an extreme sense also, right? So, which is usually known as, in our tradition, known as a hashwi approach. Addressing the texts in a very literal way, not recognizing how different the interplay or the interconnection between the different sacred texts and what that brings in terms of meanings and interpretations, and the various interpretations, the variety of interpretations and perspectives within our deen. So this alternative culture began to grow. And one of the, I said, having an extreme literal way of understanding. Number two, a disconnect with whatever was previously taught and studied in the tradition of Islam, in terms of sciences, in terms of different disciplines, and also in terms of what has been passed on from one generation to another in terms of culture. Three, this religious discourse, or this new culture that emerged, uses a very inflammatory language when it comes to matters of deen, right? It is always, da'wah is not a space for people to express their love of Islam. Da'wah is a place where people battle over what is right and wrong. Not a place where you can, teach people what is right. No, it's a place where you battle about what is right, where you fight over what is right. The differences between what is qat'i and dhanni, what is of certitude, and what is of probability or probable in the deen. What is a matter of consensus, ijma' versus a matter of different of opinions. These distinctions became blurry. People now consider or treat what is dhanni as if it's qat'i. People treat what is a matter of variety of opinion as if their own opinion or the opinion of the sheikh is the truth and nothing but the truth, right? And also, if I would add another dimension to that, there's a way of one single culture. So this religious discourse or religious rhetoric, one of the signs of it is that you find all the preachers, maybe now they're changing a little bit, but all the preachers wear the same, dress the same way, speak the same way, trying to have Muslims follow, one culture. And it was never like that. Yes, it's one deen, but multiple cultures. And you can experience the deen and see the deen and taste the deen and witness the deen in all of these varieties, right? It's like you have this, marvelous bouquet of different reflections of Islam. To one single reflection of Islam, we are going to treat all them. I'm not saying that we would do that, but it's as if they're saying it. They look at all the matters of the deen. It's not like there's a spectrum. No, what is disputed between scholars, we're going to treat it as if it's mujma' alayh. It's a matter of consensus. And this has been putting people in great difficulty in practicing the deen. But surprisingly, you can still find the rhetoric resonating with some brothers and sisters, some young folks. And I would say this is the reason behind that is sometimes the use of inflammatory language, the use of language that it was used to rally people behind a radical cause, right? People of young age, they're very zealous by nature, right? Very enthusiastic. So they want to join a mission, right? They want to, there's some kind of a fight, a battle that we're trying to win. So use that, they usually use that type of language. I think the challenges that traditional Sufi teaching is facing nowadays is providing a religious discourse that respects the minds and hearts of individuals, not relying on the legacy of the previous Sufis of the previous centuries. But what I'm talking about, that Sufis in our present time, they need to develop a religious discourse that addresses both the mind and hearts for people of young age. And we also need to stop, how would I say this? Stop talking about Gen Z. We say Gen Z this, Gen Z that, right? We speak about them rather than speaking to them. You get what I mean? We speak about them. We say Gen Z, they like this, they like that. This is a Gen Z approach. This is a Gen Z preference. So we need to move from this to actually speaking to them instead of speaking about them. And we cannot speak to them unless we genuinely try to understand, right? To understand their hopes, their aspirations, their ambitions, what they care about, what they don't care about. And we, in terms of tasawwuf also, on another front, not specifically to Gen Z, but on another front, tasawwuf nowadays needs to revive the Quranic and Hadith principles, meaning, not try to justify or argue for the legitimacy of Sufi practices based on quoting late textbooks, right? So saying, okay, Habib so-and-so used to do this, Sheikh so-and-so used to do this, these are the words of Sayyidi Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Shadili, these Sayyidi Abdul Qadir al-Jilani said so-and-so. People need to understand that there's a direct connection between the Sufi practices and the Quran and Sunnah, right? So the more we're able to revive that and to direct people to the origin and the source of the Sufi practices from the Quran and Sunnah, and to realize that these practices are not innovations, they're not bid'ah. These are actions that are based in the Quran and Sunnah. The more we're able to do that, the more people will have a clear vision. And then you can able to reconnect them with the culture that has been permeating and passed on from one generation to another. Yeah.
Seeing that we have differentiations among Muslims, whether it is difference in fiqh al-madhahib or tariqah and tasawwuf and perhaps others, but we want to see in the future Muslims come together, united. So what is the issue that needs to be addressed urgently by the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim scholars of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah?
Wow. This while seems simple in in terms of the question, but I think the answer, mashallah, I mean the questions are very deep. Let me just say one remark at the beginning in answering your question. I think this remark is that we need to realize that diversity is a form of strength. Right? Diversity is not something that is harmful whatsoever. In fact, the more variety and that we have in the ummah, the more rich it is, and the greater the mercy there is. Right? The Prophet ﷺ, it is attributed to him that he said, yes, it's people speak about the authenticity of the hadith, but the meaning is established. اختلاف أمتي رحمة. The differences or rather the variety, the diversity of my ummah. The diversity of my ummah is a rahmah. So why rahmah? Because people who have different challenges in life could seek different paths within the main path of Islam. Different lanes. Just look at it as a street that has more than one lane. So people who have speedy cars or want to go a little bit faster, but you have to drive carefully and not to go over speed limit. But they know that which lane would normally drive up to the exact speed limit. Other cars are not going as fast; they might take other lanes, for example. So we need to remind ourselves that Islam is one path that includes more than one lane within it, and they all reach to the same end, to the same objective, and that variety is a strength, not a challenge, not an obstacle. Your question is that a question about unity of the ummah, and honestly speaking, I usually find difficulty to answer this question because my concern is that sometimes we get busy thinking about the macro level, and we forget that the macro level is composed of all the different micro levels, right? So in other words, some brothers and sisters, they get busy about how we're going to unify the ummah, right? But then their household is not unified, right? So you find a young man, a young woman, Muslim, right? They're so concerned. They spend hours, days, nights, and weeks and months thinking about how can we unite the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. And they have fights with their parents, and they have fights with their siblings, and they have problems with their aunts and uncles and aunts. There are generational problems between them and their parents, or between them and their grandparents, right? There are problems within their neighborhoods. Sometimes there are problems within the mosque community itself, right? Who becomes the board member, who becomes the CEO of the masjid, right? Who is more worthy to say, who does what and this and that, and who controls the activities. If we cannot be unified within the masjid, within the mosque, if we cannot be unified as a family, whether as a household or as the wider perspective of family or as a neighborhood, then how would the entire ummah be unified, right? If we cannot unify like 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 individuals, how are you going to unify 1 billion people, right? So this is usually my concern when I think about this, is that I'm afraid that we get too much into this fantasizing about something that is at the macro level, while missing we don't have the infrastructure, right? The micro level is basically the infrastructure for that macro level unity, right? So this is my concern. But if you ask in general, not just in the perspective of the uniting of the ummah, but if you ask in general, what is the aim, or what rather should be the priority for scholars and shuyukh in our times? Something that people need to revive. I think there are a number of them. Okay, this is what comes to mind, right? Perhaps if you ask me this question tomorrow, I'll have a different answer, okay? And if you had asked me this question yesterday, maybe I would have a different answer, all right? So what comes to mind is that they need to teach people how to have a goodwill in Allah. How believers can have husn dhann, goodwill in their Lord, right? We usually speak about su' dhann. Su' dhann is to have a bad will in someone, right? And this could have different reflections. One of it is ghiba, backbiting. Backbiting is basically to speak ill about someone behind their back. Scholars say that ghiba is rooted in su' dhann. Su' dhann is basically you anticipate that person's actions have the worst intentions, right? And you cannot see that there are possibilities of goodness in that person's choice, in that person's action. And then you start to interpret their actions according to the bad will. And because of that, you start to speak bad about the person behind their back. That person is bad. They're trying to do this. They're trying to do that. They're ill-intended in their actions. And as much as we are suffering from this, with one another, some believers also suffer from this when it comes to God. Meaning to have a bad will when it comes to the choices of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He chose for you in terms of where you're born, when you're born, the conditions, the environment, the family, the friends, the experiences, the challenges, the blessings, the traumas, right? So everything that comes to being is the will of Allah. And people nowadays find difficulty to see or to have a basira, to have an insight that would penetrate through the surface of events to see the goodness that resides within the calamity. Sayyid ibn Ata'illah al-Sakandari radiyallahu ta'ala anhu says, "Man dhanna infikaka lutfihi an qadarihi fadhalika liqusuri nadarihi." Whoever assumes that his subtle gentleness is divorced from his predestinations or divorced from his decrees, that is of short-sightedness. So the priority for shuyukh and scholars to teach people how to grow, to have a broad insight, not to see things from a very narrow perspective. You know, Sada al-Ba'alawi, amongst their dua of some of the habaib, they say, Allahumma saffi sara'irana, oh Allah, purify our hearts, wa wassi' mashahidana, and grant us grant us the ability to perceive the wide perspective of things, to look at things from a vantage point that allow us the widest view possible. Because when you see things from a wide perspective, you realize details that are often overlooked, and your witnessing and your insight would then penetrate through the surface and see the good that is beyond. Sayyid ibn Ata'illah would say, you know, radiallahu anhu, رُبَّمَا أَعْطَاكَ فَمَنَعَكَ, he may give you but deprive you through giving. وَرُبَّمَا مَنَعَكَ فَأَعْطَاكَ, and he may deprive you and then give you through his deprivation. So the Sufi saints had this profound ability to have an insight through the calamities. They look through the calamity and see the goodness that lie behind it. People nowadays, because of the difficulty of life, the shackles of materialism, made them experience pain in such psychological pain and spiritual pain in such a profound way. And this trauma, basically, if not coupled with a faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, could cause great adversity. So, in a nutshell, teaching people, the priority for scholars and shuyukh is to teach people how to have a goodwill in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
MashaAllah, tamam, inshaAllah. Lastly, Sheikh, having visited Rabita Alawiyah, what is your message to Rabita Alawiyah, the organization and its members?
I'll answer your question, but by the way, I just realized that my answer to your previous question about unity, though might seem to be far from the question, but it does lead to it. If we cannot have a goodwill in the one who created us and bestowed upon us all different sorts of blessings, and we cannot have a goodwill in him, how would we have a goodwill in our colleague at work who competes with us over the promotion? If you cannot have a goodwill in Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, how are you going to have a goodwill in your neighbor? How are you going to have a goodwill in your colleague? How are you going to have a goodwill in your boss? So by having a goodwill in Allah, we develop a goodwill in His creation. When we have a goodwill in His creation, we love His creation. And that is the beginning of unity, love. Coming to your question to the Rabita Al-Alawiyya, I mean, I come here to benefit and learn from Rabita Al-Alawiyya, right? Because I feel, so little in comparison to Rabita Al-Alawiyya. MashaAllah, it's a legacy that has been there for the past 100 years. So I'm the one who should be receiving advice and guidance and mentorship, MashaAllah, and practicing da'wah and community service and social work for 100 years. This is it's a very significant achievement, MashaAllah, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant them the strength and the tawfiq to continue on this legacy for many centuries to come, inshaAllah. As we were just talking right before the recording and showing me the new platform that you guys are establishing, I think this is something that is very promising and inshallah would yield great benefit, looking at the different scholars that you guys are inviting and you guys are collaborating with. If I have a word to say, I would say just continue doing the great work that you're doing. Build collaborations and with different platforms. MashaAllah, alhamdulillah, I see that more and more platforms that are coming out, this is something that is very promising, something that is very good, but we need to see more collaborations between the different platforms. We're establishing a platform called the Forgotten Souls. It addresses the individuals who are forgotten in Muslim communities, and also tries to revive the knowledge of forgotten scholars. And perhaps we can do collaborations, between the Forgotten Souls and the Rabita Al-Alawiyya. When I came here, I was, and learning about the different achievements that you guys have been doing, and looking at the, as we were walking throughout the hallway and looking at the different, the stages and the presidents who held the presidency, the position of presidency of Rabita Al-Alawiyya throughout the different decades and so on and so forth. MashaAllah, I was greatly impressed. So, and also learning about all the great social work that you guys are doing. And now you're moving into, the da'wah that is done online, which is something that is of great importance. So I have great aspiration in the Rabita Al-Alawiyya, and alhamdulillah, I'm greatly honored and blessed by your kind invitation, and looking forward, inshallah, to be collaborating with you in future projects, inshallah.